the world thought I was leaving a monster. 3 months later, they learned I had been walking away from the only man who had ever tried to save me. The first flash exploded like lightning across the courthouse steps. Then another. And another. Reporters crowded behind metal barricades, shouting my name, shoving microphones into the cold spring air as if they could force the truth out of me before I was ready to give it. I kept walking. My heels clicked against the concrete, steady and controlled, even though my heart felt anything but. New York City stretched around me in a blur of sirens, traffic, and camera flashes. Every screen in America seemed to be carrying the same story. Sebastian Romano. Business titan. Philanthropist. Scandal. Corruption. Betrayal. His face was everywhere. On giant billboards above Times Square. On television screens inside restaurants. On newspapers folded beneath strangers' arms. And now, because of me, everyone believed they knew exactly who he was. I reached the black SUV waiting at the curb and stopped with my hand on the door handle. The crowd erupted again. Questions flew through the air faster than I could process them. Was I leaving him? Did I know the allegations were true? Had our relationship been a lie from the beginning? I didn't answer. Because the truth was far more complicated than anything they could fit into a headline. A cold wind swept down the avenue, carrying the scent of rain and exhaust. The sky above Manhattan hung low and gray, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I glanced across the street and saw his image reflected in the glass of a 40-story office tower. Sebastian Romano. The man everyone feared. The man everyone envied. The man I had once loved without hesitation. Looking at that reflection hurt more than I wanted to admit. 3 months earlier, I would have crossed any distance to stand beside him. 3 months earlier, I would have defended him against anyone. But standing there with thousands of eyes watching my every move, I wasn't sure what I believed anymore. My phone vibrated inside my coat pocket. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then I looked at the screen. One new message. No name. No picture. Just a number I knew by heart. My chest tightened immediately. The message contained only 6 words. I never lied to you, Emma. Nothing else. No explanation. No defense. No plea for forgiveness. Just 6 words that somehow felt heavier than everything being shouted around me. I stared at the screen while rain began to fall in soft drops across the city. Somewhere behind me, another reporter called my name. Somewhere across Manhattan, Sebastian Romano was fighting to keep his empire from collapsing. And somewhere between his version of the truth and mine, a secret existed that neither of us was ready to face. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and climbed into the SUV. As the door closed and the noise disappeared, I thought I was driving away from Sebastian forever. I had no idea that the real story hadn't even begun. 3 months earlier, the first time I met Sebastian Romano, I was standing in the rain outside a courthouse in Lower Manhattan holding a paper coffee cup that had already gone cold. It was almost 7 o'clock in the morning, and I had been awake since 4 finishing edits on an investigative piece that my editor insisted could not wait another day. The city was just beginning to wake up. Yellow cabs rolled through puddles. Delivery trucks crowded narrow streets. Steam drifted from subway grates and disappeared into the gray sky. I remember thinking that New York looked exhausted. Maybe I was projecting. I had spent the last 6 years chasing stories, surviving on deadlines and ambition, convincing myself that the next article would finally be the one that mattered. My phone buzzed with a text from my editor asking for another revision. I sighed and started typing a response when a black sedan pulled up along the curb. At first, I paid no attention. Cars like that appeared outside courthouses every day. Politicians. Executives. Attorneys. People with money and influence. Then the door opened. The conversation around me changed immediately. Heads turned. Voices lowered. Even before I saw him, I felt the shift. Sebastian stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a charcoal overcoat and a calm expression that somehow made everyone else seem nervous. He was taller than I expected. Dark hair. Sharp features. The kind of confidence that could not be purchased because it came from knowing exactly who you were. Two men followed several steps behind him, but he moved alone, as though the entire city belonged to him. I should have looked away. Instead, I stared for half a second too long. His eyes met mine. It lasted only a moment. Barely a heartbeat. Yet something about that look unsettled me. Not because he seemed dangerous. Because he seemed impossible to read. Most people reveal themselves if you watch closely enough. Fear. Ego. Insecurity. Desire. Sebastian Romano showed nothing. He continued toward the courthouse entrance while reporters rushed forward shouting questions. He never broke stride. Never raised his voice. Never acknowledged the chaos surrounding him. The automatic door swallowed him, and the crowd followed like a wave crashing against a seawall. I stood there watching the glass doors close behind him. Then an older photographer beside me laughed softly. "First time seeing Romano in person, huh?" I glanced at him. "Is it that obvious?" The photographer nodded. "Everyone reacts the same way." I frowned. "Why?" He adjusted the camera hanging from his neck. "Because nobody ever knows whether he is the best man in the room or the most dangerous one." Then he walked away before I could ask anything else. The words should have meant nothing. Instead, they stayed with me all day. That evening, while reviewing documents for a completely unrelated assignment, I saw his name again. Sebastian Romano. The coincidence made me pause. Looking back now, that should have been my warning. Some stories enter your life quietly. They do not knock. They simply appear. And before you realize it, they change everything. Over the next 2 weeks, Sebastian Romano became impossible to ignore. Not because I wanted to follow him, but because his name kept appearing everywhere I looked. Business journals praised him for revitalizing neighborhoods that investors had abandoned for decades. Financial networks analyzed his acquisitions as if they were military campaigns. Charity organizations credited him with funding schools, medical programs, and housing initiatives across the city. The more I researched, the more confused I became. None of it matched the rumors that seemed to trail behind him like a shadow. Every article painted a different portrait. Visionary. Billionaire. Philanthropist. Ruthless negotiator. The descriptions contradicted each other so completely that I started wondering if they were all talking about the same man. One Thursday evening, my editor called me into his office. The newsroom was nearly empty. Most of the staff had already gone home. The glow of computer monitors reflected off glass walls while rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking Midtown. My editor slid a folder across his desk. I opened it and immediately saw a familiar name printed across the top page. Sebastian Romano. I looked up. "You are assigning me a business profile?" He leaned back in his chair. "Not exactly." I frowned. "Then what is it?" He folded his arms. "There is a charity gala next week. Romano's Foundation is announcing a major education initiative. We need someone there. Someone who asks better questions than everyone else." I stared at the folder. "Why me?" "Because you do not get starstruck." The answer made me laugh. If only he knew. I accepted the assignment and took the folder home that night. My apartment overlooked a narrow street in Brooklyn where delivery trucks rattled past before sunrise and neighbors knew each other's names. It was not glamorous, but it was mine. I kicked off my shoes, made coffee, and settled at the kitchen table. Hours disappeared as I read through reports, interviews, and public records. Somewhere after midnight, I found myself studying a photograph instead of working. Sebastian stood at a ribbon-cutting ceremony surrounded by city officials and school administrators. Everyone around him was smiling for the cameras. He was not. He looked focused. Alert. As though his attention was somewhere else entirely. I could not explain why that detail bothered me. Maybe because it felt honest. Most powerful people spent their lives performing for an audience. Sebastian seemed uninterested in performing at all. Around 1 a.m, I finally closed the folder and rubbed my tired eyes. Outside, rain continued falling across the city. The streetlights cast long reflections across wet pavement. I told myself this was just another assignment. Another story. Another powerful man who happened to attract attention. Nothing more. Then my phone buzzed with an incoming email. The subject line contained only 4 words. Romano Foundation guest list. I opened the attachment. Hundreds of names filled the document. Politicians. Executives. Celebrities. Donors. At the very bottom, one final note had been added by the event coordinator. Special seating assignment approved by Mr. Romano personally. My name was listed directly beneath it. I stared at the screen for several seconds. We had exchanged exactly one glance outside a courthouse. Yet somehow, Sebastian Romano already knew who I was. The gala occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower overlooking the Hudson River. By the time I arrived, the city below had become a sea of light stretching toward the horizon. Ferries moved across dark water like floating lanterns. Inside, everything sparkled. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly near the grand staircase. Men in tailored suits discussed investments while women in elegant gowns moved through the crowd with effortless confidence. I felt completely out of place. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy dress and reminded myself that I was there to work. Nothing more. My press badge rested inside my clutch. My notebook waited beside it. Stories did not care whether I felt comfortable. They only cared whether I paid attention. A hostess guided me toward my assigned table. The moment I saw the seating arrangement, I stopped walking. Sebastian Romano's name appeared directly beside mine. I looked up at the hostess. There must be some mistake. She offered a polite smile. No mistake, Ms. Carter. The seating chart was approved personally. Before I could respond, she disappeared into the crowd. I considered leaving. Instead, I sat down and tried to convince myself that none of this mattered. The chair beside me remained empty for nearly 20 minutes. Guests continued arriving. Conversations rose and fell around the ballroom. Then the atmosphere shifted. It happened so subtly that most people probably never noticed. Voices lowered. Heads turned. Attention moved across the room like a current. I already knew who had arrived before I looked. Sebastian entered through the main doors wearing a black suit and a calm expression. He acknowledged greetings with brief nods but never stopped moving. The strange thing was not how much attention he attracted. It was how little attention he seemed to want. He carried himself like someone accustomed to responsibility rather than admiration. When he finally reached the table, his eyes found mine immediately. Good evening, Miss Carter. His voice was lower than I remembered. Controlled. Confident. I stood automatically. Good evening. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. You seem surprised to be here. I laughed softly. I think surprised is an understatement. He pulled out his chair and sat down. Fair enough. The dinner proceeded normally after that, at least on the surface. Speeches were delivered. Donations were announced. Cameras flashed. Yet throughout the evening I became increasingly aware of Sebastian's attention. Not in an uncomfortable way. More like curiosity. He asked thoughtful questions about my work. He remembered details I had mentioned in published interviews years earlier. He listened more than he spoke. That alone separated him from most influential people I had interviewed. At one point I finally asked the question that had been bothering me all night. Why am I sitting here? The music softened around us. Sebastian looked toward the city lights beyond the glass walls before answering. Because everyone else in this room tells me what they think I want to hear. Then he met my eyes again. You strike me as someone who tells the truth, even when it is inconvenient. Something about the sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. For the first time that evening, I forgot I was speaking to one of the most powerful men in New York. And that was exactly when everything started to change. After that night, I told myself I would return to normal. I would finish the article, move on to the next assignment, and forget the strange connection I felt whenever Sebastian Romano looked at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle only he could see. For exactly 4 days, that plan worked. Then the package arrived. It was waiting on my desk when I walked into the newsroom Monday morning. No return address. No company logo. Just a plain black box with my name printed neatly across the top. My coworkers immediately noticed. One of them whistled from across the room. Secret admirer? I rolled my eyes and opened the lid. Inside was a first edition copy of a book I had mentioned during the gala. A rare biography of a journalist whose work had inspired me in college. Tucked between the pages was a handwritten note. Thank you for an honest conversation. No signature was necessary. My heart recognized the handwriting before my mind did. I should have been annoyed. Instead, I found myself smiling. That realization bothered me more than the gift itself. Throughout the week, small reminders of Sebastian kept appearing in unexpected places. A community center opening in Queens. A scholarship program in the Bronx. A housing project in Brooklyn. Every time I investigated one story, his foundation seemed connected to another. Yet the more I looked, the less the public image matched the rumors surrounding him. One Friday afternoon, I finally called a source who had spent years covering New York's elite. Tell me something real about Sebastian Romano, I said. The line went quiet. Real? She asked. Yes. Not headlines. Not public relations. Just the truth. She laughed softly. That is the problem. Nobody seems to know the truth. Half the city thinks he is a hero. The other half thinks he is dangerous. Which half is right? Another pause. Maybe both. The answer stayed with me long after the call ended. That evening, rain fell steadily across Manhattan. I left work later than usual and stepped onto the sidewalk beneath a sea of umbrellas. Traffic crawled through wet streets. Neon signs reflected across puddles like broken pieces of light. My phone buzzed. A text message. I stopped walking immediately. Dinner tomorrow. No pressure. If you say no, I will survive. I stared at the message for several seconds before laughing despite myself. There was something surprisingly human about it. No arrogance. No assumption. Just a simple invitation. I typed 3 different responses and deleted all of them. Finally, I settled on one sentence. Are you always this persistent? The reply arrived less than a minute later. Only when something matters. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Around me, the city continued moving. Horns echoed through the rain. Pedestrians hurried home. Somewhere overhead, thunder rolled between skyscrapers. Yet for a moment, everything seemed strangely still. Looking back now, I realize that was the exact moment the story changed. It stopped being an assignment. It stopped being curiosity. Because without realizing it, I had begun looking forward to hearing from him. And that was far more dangerous than any rumor I had ever uncovered. The restaurant overlooked the East River, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city like a living painting. By the time I arrived, the sun had already disappeared beyond the skyline, leaving Manhattan wrapped in thousands of lights. I spotted Sebastian immediately. He was seated near the glass, a cup of coffee untouched beside him. No entourage. No crowd. No display of power. Just a man waiting. When he stood to greet me, something unexpected happened. Relief crossed his face. It lasted less than a second before disappearing, but I saw it. For some reason, that small moment stayed with me longer than anything else that evening. Dinner was surprisingly normal. We talked about books, travel, and the strange habits people develop when they spend too much time working. He admitted that he rarely slept more than 5 hours a night. I confessed that I sometimes forgot to eat when I was chasing a deadline. We laughed more than I expected. Somewhere between the appetizers and dessert, I realized I had completely stopped thinking about headlines and rumors. I was simply enjoying the conversation. That realization should have worried me. Instead, it felt comforting. At one point, I asked the question that had been lingering in my mind since our first meeting. Why me? Sebastian looked out toward the river for several seconds before answering. Most people approach me because they want something. Access. Influence. Opportunity. You never did. I folded my arms. Maybe I just have better manners. A genuine laugh escaped him. The sound surprised both of us. Then his expression softened. Maybe. Or maybe you are one of the few people who sees me as a person instead of a headline. The answer left me unexpectedly quiet. After dinner, we walked along the waterfront. A cool breeze moved across the river. Ferries drifted through the darkness. The city seemed quieter there, as if New York had finally lowered its voice for the night. We talked about our families. Our childhoods. The mistakes we had made. For the first time, Sebastian spoke about losing his father years earlier. He did not offer many details, but the grief in his voice felt real. Human. Vulnerable. Nothing like the image the public associated with him. I found myself sharing things I rarely discussed with anyone. Dreams I had abandoned. Opportunities one regretted. The fear that I was spending so much time documenting other people's lives that I had forgotten how to live my own. He listened without interrupting. Without judging. Without trying to fix anything. That simple kindness affected me more than I wanted to admit. When we finally reached my apartment building, neither of us seemed eager to end the evening. The street was quiet. Rain from earlier still glistened across the pavement. For a moment, we simply stood there beneath the glow of a street lamp. Then Sebastian glanced upward toward my apartment window and smiled faintly. Be careful, Emma. I frowned. Be careful of what? His expression changed slightly. Not everything you uncover is meant to stay buried. Before I could ask what he meant, his phone buzzed. He checked the screen. The warmth disappeared from his face almost instantly. Something was wrong. I could feel it. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and forced a small smile. Good night, Emma. Then he walked away. I stood there watching him disappear into the waiting car. Deep down, I knew that whatever message he had received was important. I just did not realize it was the beginning of the storm that would eventually tear both of our lives apart. The storm arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the first notification appeared on my screen. Then another. Then 10 more. By noon, every major news outlet in the country seemed to be running the same story. Allegations involving financial misconduct connected to companies tied to Sebastian Romano's business network had exploded across the internet. Television anchors spoke with certainty. Analysts filled entire segments with speculation. Social media transformed rumors into facts within hours. I sat frozen at my desk, staring at headlines that felt completely disconnected from the man I had come to know. Around me, the newsroom buzzed with excitement. Reporters rushed between desks. Phones rang constantly. Editors shouted updates across the room. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. Everyone except me. My editor appeared beside my chair holding a folder thick with documents. Emma, conference room. Now. 20 minutes later, I sat surrounded by colleagues while evidence was projected across a large screen. financial records, internal emails, anonymous sources. Every slide seemed more damaging than the last. I studied each document carefully, searching for something that felt wrong. Something that did not fit. But the deeper the presentation went, the more difficult it became to ignore what was in front of me. The facts appeared overwhelming. By late afternoon, reporters were camped outside Romano Holdings headquarters. Helicopters circled overhead. Cameras followed every employee entering or leaving the building. The city felt different somehow. Tense. Watching. Waiting. I sent Sebastian 3 messages. None received a reply. By evening, concern had begun replacing confusion. That was when my phone finally rang. His name appeared on the screen. Relief washed through me so quickly that I nearly answered before the first ring finished. Sebastian. Silence greeted me for several seconds. Then his voice arrived, quieter than usual. Emma. Are you okay? The question caught me completely off guard. The entire world was questioning him, yet he was asking about me. I should be asking you that. Another pause. I cannot explain everything right now. The answer made my stomach tighten. Why not? Because if I tell you anything before the investigation finishes, nobody will believe either of us. I stood and walked toward the newsroom window overlooking Manhattan. The city lights flickered below like distant stars. Sebastian, tell me one thing. Just one. Are the accusations true? The silence that followed felt endless. Long enough for doubt to slip into places trust had occupied only days earlier. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an exhaustion I had never heard before. Emma, I need you to trust me. I closed my eyes. It was not an answer. Maybe that was what frightened me most. Outside, rain began striking the glass. Tiny drops racing toward the street below. The same rain that had fallen the day we first met. The same rain that seemed to follow every important moment between us. I opened my eyes and watched the city disappear behind a curtain of water. For the first time since meeting Sebastian Romano, I was no longer sure what was true. And that uncertainty terrified me more than any headline ever could. The next week felt like living inside a collapsing building. Every morning brought a new headline. Every afternoon delivered another anonymous source. Every evening ended with experts predicting the downfall of a man they had praised only months earlier. The speed of it all made no sense. Reputations usually eroded slowly. This one was being demolished overnight. That was the first detail that began bothering me. The second was the evidence itself. I spent 3 days reviewing documents that had been leaked to nearly every major news organization in the country. Most reporters focused on the conclusions. I focused on the timeline. Dates. Signatures. Internal communications. Tiny details hidden beneath sensational claims. By Thursday, I was sitting alone in the newsroom long after everyone else had left. Empty desks stretched around me beneath rows of dim lights. Outside, Manhattan glowed against the darkness. My eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets for nearly 10 hours. I was about to give up when I noticed something strange. One document referenced a board meeting that supposedly occurred in March. Another referenced the same meeting. Same participants. Same location. Different date. I frowned and pulled both files onto my screen. The discrepancy was small. Easy to overlook. But it should not have existed. I checked a third document. Then a fourth. My pulse began to accelerate. The inconsistencies multiplied the deeper I looked. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just enough to suggest that someone had assembled the narrative in a hurry. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. For the first time since the scandal began, doubt moved in the opposite direction. Maybe the story was not as simple as everyone believed. Maybe it never had been. My phone buzzed against the desk. A text message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. Stop looking. My stomach tightened instantly. I read the message 3 times. No explanation followed. No additional warning. Just those 2 words. Most people would have ignored it. Instead, it convinced me I was finally asking the right questions. The following afternoon, I visited one of my most trusted sources, a retired accountant who had spent decades auditing corporate records. We met at a small diner in Queens where the coffee was terrible and the pie was excellent. I handed him copies of several documents and waited while he reviewed them. 20 minutes passed before he finally lowered the papers. His expression had changed. "What is it?" I asked. He tapped a page with one finger. "These records have been altered." My heartbeat stopped. "Are you sure?" He nodded slowly. "Very. Whoever prepared this wanted the alterations to remain hidden. Which means they expected people to look quickly, not carefully." I stared through the diner window at traffic moving along the street. Rain clouds gathered overhead. Somewhere across the city, Sebastian Romano was fighting for his future. Somewhere else, someone was working very hard to make sure he lost. And for the first time, I began to suspect that the person responsible might be much closer to him than anyone imagined. When I left the diner, another message was waiting on my phone. This one contained only a photograph. I opened it and felt the blood drain from my face. Standing beside Sebastian in the picture was a man I recognized immediately. A man who had publicly defended him for years. A man everyone trusted. Underneath the image was a single sentence. "You are looking at the wrong target." The photograph stayed on my mind for the next 48 hours. I enlarged it repeatedly, searching for details everyone else might miss. The man standing beside Sebastian was Daniel Mercer, Chief Financial Officer of Romano Holdings. Publicly, he was known as Sebastian's closest advisor. The media described him as loyal, disciplined, and indispensable. I had interviewed him once years earlier. He had answered every question perfectly. Too perfectly. Looking at the photograph now, I felt something I could not explain. Unease. The image had been taken at a charity event nearly 2 years earlier. Sebastian was speaking with donors. Daniel stood slightly behind him. Nothing unusual. Except Daniel was not looking at the crowd. He was looking directly at Sebastian. Not with admiration. Not with friendship. Something else. Something colder. The more I stared at the picture, the more convinced I became that I had seen that expression before. Late Friday evening, I returned to the newsroom archives. The building was almost empty. Cleaning crews moved quietly between rows of desks while rain tapped against the windows. I pulled every article mentioning Daniel Mercer during the past 5 years. Promotions. Acquisitions. Foundation projects. Corporate expansions. At first everything appeared ordinary. Then patterns emerged. Every major success attributed to Sebastian had also increased Daniel's influence inside the company. Every restructuring had moved more authority into Daniel's department. Every decision seemed to strengthen one man while the public remained focused on another. By midnight, my desk was covered in notes. Lines connected names. Dates. Transactions. Relationships. The picture growing in front of me felt less like a business story and more like a puzzle. Around 1 a.m, my phone rang. Sebastian. I stared at his name before answering. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he broke the silence. "You have been digging again." I leaned back in my chair. That almost sounded like a complaint. A faint laugh reached me through the phone. It was the first time I had heard him laugh in weeks. Then his voice grew serious. "Emma, I need you to stop chasing this alone." "Why?" "Because someone already knows what you are finding." The words sent a chill through me. I looked around the empty newsroom. Suddenly the silence felt heavier. Sebastian continued before I could respond. There are people involved who will do anything to protect themselves. I lowered my voice. Daniel Mercer? Another silence. Longer this time. Sebastian never confirmed it. He never denied it either. Instead, he asked a question. Do you remember what I told you the night we walked by the river? I closed my eyes. Not everything you uncover is meant to stay buried. Exactly. His voice sounded tired. More tired than I had ever heard it. Then tell me the truth, Sebastian. For once, tell me everything. The answer came so quietly I almost missed it. I cannot. Not yet. The call ended minutes later. I remained alone in the newsroom staring at the city beyond the glass. Thunder rolled across Manhattan. Rain streaked down the windows. Somewhere in the darkness, pieces were finally beginning to fit together. And for the first time since the scandal began, I was no longer asking whether Sebastian was guilty. I was asking who had spent years preparing to make him look that way. Everything unraveled the following week. Not slowly. Not gradually. All at once. The board of directors announced an emergency review. Investors began pulling away from projects they had supported for years. Television networks aired special reports every night. Analysts debated Sebastian's future as though he were already gone. The city that had once celebrated him now seemed eager to watch him fall. I spent most of those days chasing leads, sleeping only a few hours each night. Every answer uncovered two new questions. Every document revealed another layer beneath the surface. Yet no matter how much evidence I gathered pointing toward Daniel Mercer, nobody seemed willing to listen. Daniel remained calm in every public appearance. He spoke carefully. Confidently. Sympathetically. He expressed concern for the company. Concern for employees. Concern for investors. The performance was flawless. Which made it even more dangerous. One afternoon I stood across the street from Romano Holdings headquarters watching employees leave the building. Rain drifted through the air in a fine mist. The enormous glass tower reflected a gray sky that matched the mood of the city. A black sedan pulled to the curb. Sebastian stepped out. For a moment I barely recognized him. Not because he looked different. Because he looked exhausted. The man who once carried himself with absolute certainty now seemed burdened by something invisible. Cameras immediately rushed toward him. Questions flew from every direction. He answered none of them. He simply continued walking toward the entrance. Then, unexpectedly, he looked across the street. Directly at me. The noise around us disappeared. At least it felt that way. Hundreds of people moved between us. Traffic crawled through the intersection. Yet for one brief moment, it was only the two of us. I saw disappointment in his eyes. Not anger. Not resentment. Disappointment. As though he knew I still doubted him. The feeling hit harder than I expected. That evening, I received an email from an anonymous sender. Attached was a collection of internal correspondence dating back several years. My pulse quickened as I opened the files. The messages revealed a pattern of decisions approved by Daniel, not Sebastian. Transfers. Authorizations. Strategic recommendations. Individually they seemed insignificant. Together they formed something much larger. Something deliberate. I read until nearly 3 a.m. By the time I finished, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Daniel had been positioning himself for this moment for years. Yet another discovery stopped me cold. Buried among hundreds of communications was a private exchange between Sebastian and Daniel from 18 months earlier. Sebastian had questioned several irregularities. He had ordered an internal review. He had suspected something was wrong. My hands trembled slightly as I stared at the screen. He knew. Maybe not everything. But enough to start looking. Suddenly pieces fell into place. The delays. The silence. The refusal to defend himself publicly. Sebastian had not been protecting his reputation. He had been protecting something else. Someone else. I leaned back in my chair and stared through my apartment window at the sleeping city beyond. Rain traced thin lines down the glass. Somewhere downtown, Sebastian Romano was losing his company, his influence, and his good name. And for the first time, I understood the terrible possibility that haunted every unanswered question. What if he had allowed the world to blame him because exposing the real truth would destroy someone he had sworn to protect? The answer arrived on a cold Sunday morning. I found it in a file that was never supposed to reach me. The document appeared in my inbox without warning, attached to an email containing no message, no signature, and no explanation. Just one encrypted archive. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside were years of private records. Internal investigations. Legal reviews. Confidential correspondence. The deeper I read, the harder it became to breathe. Sebastian had discovered irregularities almost 2 years earlier. He had ordered audits. Expanded reviews. Quietly hired outside experts. Every step pointed toward the same conclusion. Daniel Mercer had been manipulating financial systems for years while hiding behind Sebastian's reputation. Yet one detail changed everything. Daniel was not acting alone. Buried within the records was another name. Olivia Romano. Sebastian's younger sister. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Olivia had served on several charitable boards connected to the company. Publicly, she was known for her philanthropy and community work. The city adored her. According to the documents, she had unknowingly signed approvals that Daniel later used to legitimize fraudulent transactions. She had trusted him completely. Sebastian discovered the truth months earlier. Instead of exposing everything immediately, he tried to untangle the damage quietly. He believed he could protect Olivia from public humiliation while still uncovering the full scope of Daniel's actions. He was wrong. Daniel realized Sebastian was getting too close. The scandal had not been created to hide a crime. It had been created to stop an investigation. I leaned back from my laptop and covered my face with both hands. Suddenly every unanswered question made sense. Every silence. Every hesitation. Every moment Sebastian refused to defend himself publicly. He had been protecting his sister. Not because she was guilty, but because she was vulnerable. The realization hit me like a wave. While the world condemned him, he had chosen to carry the blame rather than destroy someone he loved. My phone rang before I could process the emotion rising in my chest. It was Olivia. I had interviewed her once during a charity event. Her voice sounded fragile. "Emma, we need to talk." An hour later we met inside a quiet church near Central Park. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting colors across the wooden pews. Olivia looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She sat beside me and stared ahead for several moments before speaking. He knew I would blame myself if the truth became public. Tears filled her eyes. Sebastian spent months trying to fix everything without hurting me. I swallowed hard. Why did he never tell anyone? Olivia laughed bitterly. Because that is who he is. He would rather lose everything himself than watch someone he loves suffer. Silence settled between us. Outside, church bells echoed across the city. 4 months I had searched for evidence. Facts. Proof. Yet sitting there beside Olivia, I finally understood something more important. The story was never about money or power. It was about sacrifice. And the man I had doubted was carrying a burden he was never supposed to carry alone. When I left the church, I looked toward the Manhattan skyline and realized there was only one thing left to do. This time, I was going to fight for the truth. And I was going to start by finding Sebastian Romano. Finding Sebastian turned out to be easier than I expected. Convincing him to let me help was another matter entirely. He was staying at a quiet property outside the city, far from reporters and cameras. The house overlooked a stretch of gray water beneath an overcast sky. It was beautiful in the way lonely places often are. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, surprise flashed across his face. Then concern. "Emma. What are you doing here?" I stepped inside before I could lose my nerve. "I know the truth." The words hung between us. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he closed the door quietly and looked away. "You should not have come." I felt frustration rise immediately. "That is your response? After everything that has happened?" He walked toward the window overlooking the water. His shoulders looked heavier than I remembered. "I was trying to protect you." I laughed once, unable to stop myself. "You keep saying that. Do you know what would have helped?" "The truth." Sebastian remained silent. I moved closer. "Olivia told me everything. The audits. Daniel. The investigation. All of it." His eyes closed briefly. When he opened them again, the exhaustion inside them nearly broke my heart. "Emma, if Daniel realized how much evidence I had collected, he would have destroyed Olivia's reputation. Everything she spent her life building would have disappeared overnight. So you decided to sacrifice yourself instead." His expression said enough. I shook my head slowly. "You really thought carrying this alone was the answer?" Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. The same rain that seemed determined to follow every turning point in our lives. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I handed him the folder I had brought. He frowned. "What is this?" "Evidence. More than enough to expose Daniel publicly." I watched his expression change as he flipped through the pages. Financial records. Correspondence. Testimony. Every piece carefully verified. Every claim supported. By the time he reached the final page, he looked up at me in disbelief. "How did you get all this?" I smiled faintly. "You are not the only stubborn person in New York." For the first time in months, something close to hope appeared in his eyes. The sight almost made me cry. The following week became a blur of meetings, legal reviews, interviews, and endless preparation. The truth spread more slowly than the lies had, but it spread. Independent investigators confirmed key findings. Former employees stepped forward. Journalists began asking different questions. Daniel Mercer stopped giving interviews. Then he disappeared from public view entirely. One evening, after another exhausting day, Sebastian and I stood on a rooftop overlooking Manhattan. The city glowed beneath us. Millions of lights stretching toward the horizon. Neither of us spoke for a while. We simply watched the skyline. Finally, he broke the silence. "You should have walked away from me months ago." I looked at him. "Maybe." His smile was sad. "Most people would have." I thought about everything we had survived. The doubts. The mistakes. The secrets. The distance. Then I reached for his hand. Most people did not know the man behind the headlines. I did. And this time, I was not letting him face the storm alone. 3 months later, I found myself standing on the same courthouse steps where this story had begun. The same stone columns. The same crowded sidewalks. The same city rushing forward without ever slowing down. But everything else had changed. Reporters filled the plaza once again. Cameras pointed toward the entrance. Microphones waited for statements. This time, however, the questions were different. Independent investigations had confirmed what the evidence had been showing all along. The narrative that had dominated headlines for months had collapsed beneath the weight of the truth. Daniel Mercer had manipulated information, concealed critical records, and orchestrated a campaign designed to redirect attention away from his own actions. Public opinion shifted almost overnight. Some people apologized. Most pretended they had never doubted Sebastian in the first place. That was the strange thing about public judgment. It moved quickly. Accountability rarely moved with it. I stood near the edge of the crowd watching sunlight reflect from nearby skyscrapers. Spring had finally arrived in New York. Trees along the streets carried fresh green leaves. The air felt lighter somehow. Hopeful. The courthouse doors opened. Conversations immediately quieted. Sebastian stepped outside. For a moment, memories collided. The powerful businessman everyone admired. The exhausted man who had stood alone while the world turned against him. The person who had chosen sacrifice over self-preservation. All of them existed at once. He walked down the steps calmly, answering a few questions before making his way toward the waiting crowd. Then his eyes found mine. Just as they had months earlier. Except this time there was no disappointment between us. No uncertainty. No distance. Only understanding. The reporters continued shouting questions, but he ignored them. Instead, he crossed the remaining space and stopped directly in front of me. Neither of us spoke immediately. We did not need to. Some moments are too important for words. Finally, Sebastian smiled. The same smile I had not seen in what felt like forever. You stayed. His voice was quiet enough that only I could hear it. I smiled back. You finally told the truth. A laugh escaped him. Fair point. Around us, cameras continued flashing. The city continued moving. Yet none of it seemed to matter anymore. Weeks later, life began finding a new rhythm. Not perfect. Not easy. Just real. Sebastian focused on rebuilding what mattered most. His foundation resumed its work. Community projects reopened. Scholarships continued helping students pursue opportunities they never thought possible. Olivia returned to public life stronger than before. As for me, I finished the story that had changed everything. Not the version built on rumors. The real one. The complicated one. The human one. Sometimes people ask whether all the pain was worth it. Whether the losses justified the outcome. I always think about the answer before responding. Then I remember a rainy night beside the river. A man who carried burdens he never spoke about. A city that judged before it understood. And a truth that refused to stay hidden forever. The answer is yes. Because money can influence people. Power can intimidate people. Scandals can convince entire cities to look away. But none of those things are stronger than truth. And when truth finally has the courage to stand in the light, the people who belong together usually find their way back to each other. Looking back now, that is what I remember most. Not the headlines. Not the accusations. Not even the victory. I remember the choice. The choice to trust. The choice to stay. The choice to love someone when it would have been easier to walk away. And in the end, that choice changed everything.